experienced before.
Exactly.
And when you come out of a deep, deep darkness, your joy and your happiness is different.
And everybody sees that.
And you measure it different, and it shows different because of the darkness that you've been through.
Yeah.
It comes out different, and you.
For years, Joni Lamb and Dr. Doug Weiss appeared to be the picture of faith, power, and unity, a couple leading the Christian world with confidence. But behind the polished smiles and televised sermons, something darker was brewing. Now, Rodney Howard steps forward with shocking revelations that could change everything you thought you knew about Daystar, their marriage, and the truth they tried to keep hidden. When Marcus Lamb passed away in late 2021, it felt like the heart of Daystar stopped beating. For decades, Marcus wasn't just a preacher on TV. He was the vision, the drive, the fire behind everything the ministry stood for. He and Joni had built Daystar from scratch, starting with almost nothing but a dream and a deep belief that they were meant to bring the gospel to the world. Together, they turned that dream into one of the most recognized Christian networks on the planet. People trusted them. They were a couple that represented strength, faith, and family, the kind of unity everyone wanted to believe in. So when the news came that Marcus had died, it wasn't just a personal loss for the Lamb family. It was a shockwave that hit millions of viewers. Inside the ministry, staff members cried openly. Viewers sent thousands of messages and donations, saying how much Marcus had changed their lives. For many, it felt like losing a pastor or even a family member. But no one felt the loss deeper than Joni. Overnight, she went from being the co-host and supportive wife to being the face of a global ministry that now had no clear leader. At first, people surrounded her with love and compassion. They told her to take her time, to grieve, to rest. "You don't have to rush," they said. "God will guide you." And for a while, it seemed like she was trying to do just that. She appeared on camera, her voice softer, her eyes filled with pain, talking about Marcus's faith and the hope that they would meet again in heaven. Viewers cried with her. It was raw, it was real, and it was human. But as the months passed, things began to shift. The sympathy that had once been endless slowly turned into expectation. People started wondering, what's next for Daystar? Could Joni carry the weight of what Marcus had built? Was she strong enough, or even meant, to lead the ministry on her own? Every decision she made was suddenly under a microscope. If she changed a program, people asked, would Marcus have approved? If she invited a new guest, they whispered, is she taking Daystar in a different direction? It was as if she couldn't win no matter what she did. Behind the scenes, the pressure must have been unbearable. Joni was grieving her husband, trying to be strong for her children, and at the same time keeping a massive organization afloat. Friends say she rarely rested, throwing herself into work as a way to cope. But the grief didn't go away. It just hid behind long meetings, bright studio lights, and forced smiles. The woman who had once laughed so easily on air now carried a quiet heaviness, one that everyone could see but few dared to mention. Daystar without Marcus felt different. His booming energy, his charisma, his fire, it was gone, and no matter how hard Joni tried, there was no way to fill that space. It wasn't her fault, it just wasn't possible. The ministry began to feel like a ship that had lost its captain. Loyal viewers still tuned in, but the atmosphere had changed. Something unspoken hung in the air, a mix of grief, uncertainty, and fear about what the future would hold. And while Joni tried to hold everything together, a quiet storm was already starting to build beneath the surface, one that would soon grow into something far bigger than anyone at Daystar could have imagined. After Marcus's death, Joni tried to stay strong. For months, she poured everything she had into holding Daystar together, showing up on camera with a brave face even when her eyes told another story. The pain of losing her husband, her partner in life and ministry, never really went away. She talked about him often, smiled through memories, and reminded viewers that faith could heal even the deepest wounds. But grief is a strange thing. It doesn't move in straight lines. It lingers, twists, and sometimes makes you reach for something, or someone, to help you breathe again. That's how Doug Weiss entered the picture. At first, he was just a familiar name in Christian circles. Doug was a counselor, an author, and a man known for helping others through emotional and spiritual healing. He had been on Christian TV for years, speaking about relationships, faith, and recovery. When Joni and Doug began talking, it seemed natural. Two people from the same world, both familiar with ministry life. both having known their own struggle. What started as conversations about faith and healing eventually turned into something more personal. People who knew Joni say she began to smile again. For the first time in a long while, she seemed lighter, more alive. Those close to her believed Doug brought a sense of comfort that she desperately needed. Someone who understood her pain but didn't treat her like she was fragile. Their connection grew, quietly at first, away from cameras and public eyes. But in the world Joni lived in, privacy didn't last long. When rumors began to circulate that she was dating, the reactions were immediate and divided. Some were genuinely happy for her. They said, she deserves joy again. She's been through so much. They saw her relationship with Doug as a sign that God was restoring her heart, bringing her a second chance at love. But others saw it differently. For them, it felt too soon. Marcus had passed not even 2 years earlier, and to see Joni appear publicly beside another man, especially one with his own complicated history, felt like betrayal. Social media lit up with comments, many of them harsh. How could she move on so fast? Some wrote. Did she ever truly grieve? Others asked. The controversy grew when news broke that Joni and Doug were getting married. Headlines spread across Christian media, and every outlet had its own spin on the story. Some called it a story of redemption. Others labeled it a scandal. Even among the Daystar audience, opinions split sharply. Supporters flooded her with messages of love, saying they were happy she found someone to share life with again. Critics accused her of disrespecting Marcus's legacy and moving too quickly, not just in love but in leadership. Inside the Lamb family, the situation was even more delicate. Jonathan Lamb, Joni and Marcus's son, had always been seen as the natural heir to Daystar. He'd grown up in the ministry, hosting shows, preaching, and carrying his father's energy and presence. But as Joni's relationship with Doug became public, something changed. Slowly, Jonathan started appearing less on air. Viewers noticed. Where's Jonathan? They asked. Why isn't he leading anymore? Behind closed doors, tensions rose. Some say Jonathan struggled to understand his mother's decisions, not just as a son mourning his father, but as a man watching the ministry's direction shift in ways he didn't agree with. Reports began to circulate that he was being asked to publicly support the marriage, even though his heart wasn't ready. For Jonathan, it was an impossible choice: stay silent and seem disapproving, or speak up and betray his own grief. For Joni, the situation must have felt equally painful. She wasn't trying to replace Marcus, at least not in her mind. She was trying to survive, to find hope again, to feel human again. But the world she lived in didn't make space for that kind of vulnerability. Every move she made was judged not as a widow or a woman, but as a public figure representing faith. The same people who once praised her strength were now questioning her sincerity. Doug, too, brought his own baggage. Though respected in Christian counseling, he had a past that critics were quick to unearth. Old stories, previous relationships, controversies, all resurfaced the moment his name was linked to Joni's. Suddenly, he wasn't just a man in love. He was the center of scrutiny. His credibility as a counselor was questioned. His motives doubted. People online speculated whether he saw Joni as a partner or an opportunity. It didn't matter what the truth was. Perception had already taken hold. As the relationship progressed, the once private pain of the Lamb family became public spectacle. Tabloids, YouTube commentators, and church gossip all joined in. Everyone had an opinion, and few had compassion. The narrative shifted from a widow finding love again to a ministry in chaos. Every photograph, every statement, every silence was analyzed like evidence in a trial. Within Daystar, the pressure only grew. Employees whispered in hallways, unsure which side to take. Some stayed loyal to Jonathan, believing he represented Marcus's true legacy. Others supported Joni, arguing that she had earned the right to lead and to live her life. Meetings that once focused on spreading the gospel now carried tension, with unspoken questions hanging in the air. Was Doug being positioned as a leader? Was the network changing direction? Could it survive this level of division? For Joni, the emotional toll must have been immense. The very people who once cheered her faith were now picking apart her choices. She had buried her husband, tried to lead through grief, and now was being criticized for finding joy again? In interviews, she spoke with conviction, saying that Doug was part of her healing, that she had prayed about the decision, that God had given her peace. But the louder she spoke, the more the internet shouted back. Her story, once about love and resilience, became twisted into something darker, a symbol of controversy in the Christian world. It was as if people forgot she was human, that she could feel loneliness, or that faith doesn't erase the need for companionship. Yet no matter how she explained herself, the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, spreading from online forums to church pulpits. And in the middle of it all stood a woman who had already lost so much. The grief of losing Marcus had never really faded. It had simply changed shape. Now, instead of tears in private, it came in the form of headlines, criticism, and endless judgment. The love she found, something that should have been a blessing, had turned into another storm to survive. As the dust settled, one thing became painfully clear. What began as a story of healing had become a story of division. A widow's attempt to rebuild her life had reopened wounds, not only in her family, but in an entire faith community watching from afar. Joni's relationship with Doug wasn't just about love anymore. It had become a mirror reflecting something much deeper: the struggle between grace and judgment, between personal happiness and public expectation, between being human and being holy in the eyes of a watching world. The story could have ended with controversy over love, but it didn't. The next chapter in Joni Lamb's life and in the life of Daystar was not about emotions or relationships. It was about money. And in the world of ministry, money can be both a blessing and a curse. For years, Daystar had been seen as one of the most trusted Christian networks in the world. People believed in it not just because of the programs, but because they believed their donations were being used for something good: to spread the gospel, to help the needy, to bring light where there was darkness. Joni and Marcus had built that image together. Their message was simple: your giving changes lives. And for decades, people believed it. But when questions about Daystar's finances started to surface, that trust began to crack. It started quietly. Small comments online, a few murmurs among donors, nothing that seemed serious. Someone asked why the ministry needed a new private jet. Another person noticed changes in how Daystar talked about its projects, with less transparency than before. And then, as often happens in the internet age, those small whispers grew into a storm. Social media lit up with posts showing photos of the jet, sleek, white, expensive-looking, and captions that asked, "Is this where your donations are going?" For longtime supporters, it was painful to see. They remembered giving faithfully, even when times were hard, believing every dollar helped feed the poor or fund missions around the world. Now, it looked like that money might have been used for luxury. Joni tried to explain. She said the jet was necessary for ministry work, for travel, for outreach, for spreading the message globally. And in truth, many large ministries do have jets for that reason. But context is everything. The timing was terrible. Churches across the country were still recovering from pandemic losses, families were struggling financially, and here was a multi-million-dollar aircraft purchased by a ministry that preached humility and stewardship. Even if it made sense on paper, it didn't look right to the people watching. The questions didn't stop there. Online rumors began spreading about large sums of money being moved between accounts, about possible offshore funds, about spending that didn't seem to match Daystar's usual financial reports. None of it was proven, at least not publicly. But that didn't matter. Once people start to doubt where their money goes, the damage is already done. Inside Daystar, the tension grew. Employees who had dedicated their lives to the ministry started to whisper in private. Was everything as honest as they'd been told? Could the organization survive if the donations slowed down? Meetings that used to be about programming and faith turned into conversations about damage control. Some staff members left quietly, unwilling to be caught in the middle of the growing controversy. Others stayed, but the trust, the invisible glue that had held everything together, was fading fast. Outside the organization, the reaction was even louder. Churches that had once partnered with Daystar began to distance themselves. Pastors who had appeared on the network declined invitations. Some ministries even issued polite but pointed statements about financial transparency without naming names. But everyone knew who they were talking about. Donations started to drop. It wasn't sudden, but steady. A slow erosion of faith. Families who had once mailed in $5 checks every month stopped giving. Businessmen who had written big donations quietly moved on to other ministries. And with each dollar lost came another reminder that reputation is everything in the world of faith-based organizations. For Joni, it was a personal heartbreak. She had already been through the pain of losing Marcus, then the backlash over her new marriage. Now she was being accused of something even deeper: betraying the trust of the very people who had supported her for decades. She went on camera and in interviews, her voice calm but firm, saying that every decision had been made for the good of the ministry. She talked about growth, outreach, expansion, but the more she explained, the less people seemed to believe. That's the cruel thing about public perception. Once doubt takes root, it's almost impossible to erase. People who had defended her before were now unsure. They didn't want to think badly of her, but they couldn't ignore the questions. The comments online turned harsher. Why won't she just show the receipts? If everything's fine, why so many excuses? The more Daystar tried to control the narrative, the more the story seemed to slip out of their hands. Even within her circle of friends and ministry partners, things changed. Some who had once stood proudly beside Joni now kept their distance, afraid that being associated with Daystar might hurt their own reputations. Invitations to conferences stopped coming. Joint projects quietly disappeared. Joni, who had spent her life surrounded by people, began to find herself increasingly isolated. Meanwhile, the financial pressure on Daystar continued to grow. The donations that kept the network running, the lifeblood of every program, every broadcast, every outreach, were shrinking. Staff cuts were whispered about. Projects were delayed. Viewers noticed fewer new shows, fewer live events. The once vibrant ministry began to feel quieter. But the hardest part wasn't the numbers. It was the loss of something far more important: trust. Trust is fragile in any relationship, but in a ministry, it's sacred. People don't just give money. They give faith. They give because they believe the people they're giving to are honest, humble, and guided by something bigger than themselves. When that trust breaks, it doesn't just affect the bank account, it affects the soul. For many longtime supporters, Daystar's troubles felt like personal betrayal. They had prayed for the Lamb family, defended them against criticism, believed in their calling. Now they weren't sure what to believe. And that confusion, that mix of love, disappointment, and doubt, spread far beyond the Daystar offices. It reached into living rooms, churches, and small groups across the country. Joni did what she could to hold on. She kept hosting shows, speaking about faith, trying to remind people that Daystar was still doing good work. But the shadow over the ministry grew longer. Even if every accusation wasn't true, the questions were enough to cause real damage. In the world of public faith, perception often matters more than proof. By this point, the story was no longer just about a widow, a marriage, or a ministry. It was about credibility, something that takes a lifetime to build and a moment to lose. The financial storm became a spiritual one, shaking the foundations of trust that had supported Daystar for so long. And as donations continued to fall and criticism continued to rise, one question hung over everything: could Daystar ever regain the confidence of its people? Because once a ministry loses that, once believers stop believing, it's not just an organization that's in trouble, it's a faith community that's been wounded. And no matter how strong the leader, rebuilding that kind of trust takes more than money, more than words. It takes time, humility, and a kind of honesty that can't be faked. When the rumors turned into headlines, everything changed. What had started as quiet talk among church circles exploded into a full-blown media storm. Suddenly, everyone had an opinion about Joni Lamb, Weiss, and what was happening at Daystar. News sites, podcasts, YouTube channels, they all jumped on the story. The headlines were sharp and emotional. Scandal rocks Daystar, from grief to controversy, and the fall of Christian royalty. For years, Joni had been admired as a strong woman of faith, someone who stood beside her husband and carried their ministry with grace. Now those same outlets that once praised her were questioning her integrity. Clips of her interviews were cut, re-edited, and shared online with dramatic music and clickbait titles. Everyone seemed to be digging for more details, more mistakes, more proof that the perfect image of Daystar wasn't so perfect after all. The online world was merciless. Social media turned into a battlefield. Supporters and critics fought in the comments, quoting Bible verses to prove their points. "Judge not, lest you be judged," one person wrote. Another replied, "Leaders should be held accountable." What had once been a ministry that united people now divided them. Every new post brought a flood of emotion: anger, sadness, confusion, and disappointment. For many viewers, this wasn't just gossip, it was personal. They had trusted Joni and Marcus for years, invited them into their homes through the television, prayed with them. Seeing their ministry fall into scandal felt like watching a piece of their own faith crumble. People asked themselves painful questions. If they can fail, what about the rest of us? Can anyone in ministry be trusted? Inside Daystar, the atmosphere was tense. Employees tried to keep working, but the pressure was impossible to ignore. Some staff quietly left. Others stayed, hoping things would settle down. Phone calls from donors slowed, partnerships disappeared. Pastors who had once preached on Daystar distanced themselves, afraid of being caught in the backlash. The network that once symbolized light and hope now felt heavy and uncertain. Joni tried to hold on. She spoke publicly, asking for understanding and forgiveness, saying that God was still in control. But every word she said was picked apart online. To some, she sounded sincere. To others, defensive. There was no right move. Silence looked like guilt, and speaking up looked like damage control. Doug faced his own firestorm. His past was dragged out for the world to see. People questioned his motives, his reputation, even his faith. The marriage that had been meant to heal two broken hearts had become the center of relentless public judgment. For both Joni and Doug, life turned into a kind of spotlighted trial, and the world was the jury. But the deepest wound wasn't to their reputations. It was to the people who had believed in them. Longtime viewers began to question not just the leaders, but their own faith. It's one thing to lose trust in a person. It's another to feel your spiritual foundation shake. Churches had to address the scandal because their congregations were asking questions. Some urged forgiveness. Others warned against blind loyalty. The noise eventually faded, but the damage stayed. Daystar continued broadcasting, but something had changed. Not just in the ministry, but in the hearts of those who had once found comfort in it. The faith of many had been tested in ways they never expected. And that's what made this storm so devastating. It wasn't only about public failure or bad headlines. It was about faith colliding with human weakness. People saw that even the most admired leaders can fall, and that realization left a mark. When the cameras moved on and the online chatter slowed, one truth remained: rebuilding trust, especially spiritual trust, takes time, honesty, and a kind of humility that no spotlight can fake.